There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. And today's episode is all about crystal oscillators. At first glance, there are only two recipes for crystal oscillators. We've got the basic recipe, which just requires quartz crystals, cable, and reinforced iron plates. And then there's the alternate recipe called insulated crystal oscillator, which also requires quartz crystals, except this time we also need some rubber and AI limiters. So as usual, I've laid out the basic and alternate recipe, including one bonus recipe that I'll show towards the end of today's video. We'll then compare all of them, including their power consumptions and resource consumptions as well, to see what is the best recipe. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video. We are starting with the basic recipe first, and for all three of these recipes, we'll be creating 5 crystal oscillators per minute. So let's start with the cable, since this is probably the easiest thing to make here. All we need is our 70 copper ore. This makes our 70 copper ingots, which then makes our 140 wire, which we then turn into cable. In total, there are 4 different recipes to create your cable. However, I've gone for this basic recipe since I believe it's just one of the best. It's so easy to do, it's simple, and everyone has this recipe unlocked from the get-go. No alternate recipes needed. Whereas the coated cable requires heavy ore residue, which is a liquid, which then also requires the refinery, which consumes a lot of power and is quite unnecessary for this project. And these 2 recipes down here require rubber, and I don't really want to be getting quick wire or rubber involved with any of these recipes, so I'm going to be sticking with the basic. When it comes to wire, simply put, I don't want to be messing with Caterium. Caterium has much more important uses than turning it into wire, so unless you've got a bunch of Caterium lying around, I recommend just sticking to the basic recipe or using iron wire, which I'll be using in my third example. Very quickly, I really want to try and highlight ingots. I've mentioned this in a few other of my videos. As you can see, I've made quite a lot of videos now comparing recipes with each other. They're all available on the channel if you wish to go see them. But there's one point I always highlight in these videos, and that's pure ingots. That is right, we are heading back to the refinery. So as of right now, we need 70 copper ore to make our 70 copper ingots to make 140 wire. Except if you use the refinery to make our 70 copper ingots, now we only need 28 copper ore. This saves us a total of 42 copper ore, which of course is fantastic. The only downside to this though is that we now need water, and 18.667 is not a lot, but eventually when you've got hundreds of refineries, or dozens, hundreds, whatever you want to use for your bigger projects, this does start to add up. Not to mention the logistical challenges. You've got to try and find a way to get your water into your refinery, whereas the basic copper ingot recipe, the only thing you need is copper. You can also do this for Caterium, iron, quartz crystals, copper sheets, and also concrete as well, where you can use limestone to combine it with water just to get more concrete from your limestone. I know that I mention pure ingots in every single video, but they are extremely important to be aware about. Let's move on now to our quartz crystal recipe. Here we are going to need 150 raw quartz to turn into 90 quartz crystals. This will obviously then be used to make our 5 crystal oscillators. If you wish to use the pure quartz crystals refinery recipe to make your 90 quartz crystals, you're only going to need 115.714 raw quartz and roughly 64 water per minute, compared to 150 raw quartz. Just very quickly, if you enjoy videos like this and you want more guides, tips and tricks, then feel free to subscribe if you wish. You don't have to, but it's a good way to support the channel. You'll also get notified whenever I drop one of these videos. Thank you for all the continued support on the channel, but without further ado, let's get straight back into the video. However, you're not really saving much quartz using this, and of course you then have to use water, which costs a lot of power for your water extractors, and it's just a bit more of a logistical nightmare. So I do recommend just sticking to this unless you are really desperately trying to save some of your raw quartz. The final recipe that we then need for our 5 crystal oscillators is our 12.5 reinforced iron plates, and this recipe is the basic reinforced iron plate recipe. Again, there are 4 ways to make your reinforced iron plates. This involves a lot of screws, so I don't really bother doing it. This involves rubber, so again, I don't particularly bother doing that. This is the basic recipe, which I'm just about to show you. And then this recipe I'll be using in my third example. I have got a full video talking about reinforced iron plates, which I'll show on the screen right now, so feel free to check that out after today's video. Despite this being the basic recipe, I have made one quick change, and that is with our screws. As you can see, we are going from iron ingots straight into screws, and that is because we are using a cast screw recipe. This absolutely brilliant recipe down here means that you can convert your iron ingots to your screws at no additional cost. This way you save on having to make iron rods, which saves you in power, resources, time and energy. It's a fantastic recipe and easily top 5 best recipes in Satisfactory. Also, if you so wish, you can indeed use steel to make screws. I don't recommend that you do this unless you've got a bunch of steel lying around. If you'd like to know the best recipes for steel beams and other steel items, I recommend watching this video currently on the screen. And that is it for our basic crystal oscillator recipe. And this is why the thumbnail for today's video is crystal oscillators are easier than you think, because I always consider crystal oscillators a late game item, but looking at this now, there is nothing here that's complicated to make. You make reinforced iron plates relatively early game, and that's the most complex thing to make here. So really, this is quite a basic recipe. It's just connecting all of them together, which might take a little bit of time. So let's have a quick look at everything that you need. First of all, you are going to be needing 5 manufacturers, which is an absolute shame. This is because at 100% clock speed, you can only make 1 crystal oscillator per minute. So obviously to make 5, you then have to have 5 of them at 100% efficiency. Or of course, you can just overclock this to 250 and then place down 2 manufacturers, but regardless, you are consuming the same amount of power. Unless you use a Somers loop, then it's a hell of a lot more. Secondly, you're going to be needing 3 assemblers. This is to make our reinforced iron plates. This next part is not a typo. You generally need 19 constructors to make everything from your wire, to your cable, to your quartz crystals, to your screws, to your iron plates. So yeah, you're going to be needing quite a lot of constructors for the basic recipe, and you're going to need a total of 8 smelters. This comes out to around about 420, well, I've got megawatts written there twice. This comes out to a total of 428 megawatts worth of power, which might sound like quite a lot, but yet again, you are making 5 crystal oscillators per minute. Overall, this recipe is not bad at all. However, I think it's rather important that we still give the second recipe a glance, just in case it turns out to be much better. And let's start with the worst thing to do with this recipe, and that's the rubber. Unfortunately, yes, you are going to need 35 rubber per minute. There are 3 different ways of making rubber, and in theory, this is the best, where you use both fuel and plastic to then create your rubber. Then after this, you then combine rubber with more fuel to create more plastic. You then combine more plastic with more fuel to create more rubber, and essentially the cycle just continues. That's the best way to get rubber and plastic. There's also this recipe over here, which is the one that I'm currently using, which turns crude oil straight into rubber with some heavy oil residue as a reserve, as a byproduct, which is not too bad. And then you've got, I suppose, the basic recipe, which requires polymer resin, which is a byproduct that you can get from other crude oil shenanigans, and water, which is not too bad at all. But again, I've used this recipe right here because it's the most basic and simplistic recipe for this example. But bear in mind, there are 3 that you can choose from, this one being the best. And here's a very quick example of what that would look like. So again, we are using our crude oil to make plastic. We're then turning our plastic into heavy oil residue and then combining it with the rubber. This heavy oil residue then comes down over there, combines with water to make fuel, and then using our diluted fuel recipe, we then make rubber. Regardless, moving on from that, we've now got ourselves our quartz crystals. And this time, we are only needing 50 quartz crystals, which is less than our first example. If you remember, in our basic example, we were using 90 quartz crystals, so we are saving almost half of our quartz crystals, meaning that we then save half of our raw quartz, respectively. This is not bad at all. Moving on though, we've now got our AI limiters, and especially if you are early game, this might seem a bit overcomplicated, but when you look at it, it's really not. All you're going to need is copper ore and caterium ore. And if you remember correctly for our copper sheet recipe, you can indeed make this in the refinery, and there's quite a long recipe for this. What you could do if you really wanted, I'm just showing this as an example, but what you could do is combine your copper ore with your water to form the pure copper ingots, which of course requires less copper ore. You can then combine your copper ingots with your water to form, I think it's called steamed copper sheets, which then uses a lot less copper ingots, which then uses a lot less copper ore. So doing this recipe is a great way to save on copper if you are desperately trying to save on it. The only downside is that these recipes both require refineries, which are much bigger than smelters or constructors, and of course they consume more power. Additionally, you also have to get water involved as well. But if you're completely fine with water, and if you don't mind setting up water logistics, this is a great way to preserve the amount of copper you use in your world. But there's also nothing wrong with doing this as well. Moving over to our quickwire, and this recipe is nice and simple. We're just using our Caterium ore to form our Caterium ingots to then form our quickwire, that's then used for the AI limiters. And remember, you can always make Caterium ingot in the refinery if you so wish. There's also other ways to make quickwire too. There's the basic recipe, which I'm currently demonstrating, which is nice and easy. And if you have got some extra copper lying around, and if you're not using it for your copper sheets, you can also use it to form this recipe, which requires less Caterium ingots, obviously, but then requires copper. So feel free to do this if you wish, or just stick to the basic recipe, which is what I'm going to do. There's also another AI limiter recipe, but this one involves plastic. And that is it for our insulated crystal oscillator alternate. Let's have a quick look at what we are consuming here. So firstly, we are going to be using 6 manufacturers, which is not ideal, but it is what it is. We also need just 1 assembler, which is not too bad, 8 constructors, 9 smelters, and 2 refineries, which consumes a maximum of 473 megawatts. Now, before I compare the basic and alternate recipe, there's one more example I'd like to show you, which is also the basic recipe, but I've used a couple of alternate recipes you might quite like. So let's start with the cable. To make our 70 cable per minute, we are still needing 140 wire, except this time we are using a recipe called iron wire, which, as the name suggests, uses iron to make your wire, which saves us on all of our copper, which is great. The second recipe, unfortunately, I can't really do much about, and that's making our quartz crystals. I can, in theory, use pure quartz crystals, which saves us some raw quartz, but like I've previously demonstrated, it is quite a hassle and not particularly worth it, so I haven't messed with this recipe. Lastly, when it comes to our reinforced iron plates, our regular iron plates recipe is the same, except this time I'm using wire. This way, again, I'm also implementing our iron wire recipe, which I've just showed you guys over here, that uses just iron. So we are using 0 copper in this project. And in total, this comes out to 188 iron ore and 150 raw quartz, which is so much easier to find together than our previous example, which again was copper, Caterium, raw quartz, and crude oil. So logistically, this is so much better. Let's have a very quick look at our power consumption. So we are going to be needing 5 manufacturers to create our crystal oscillators. We're also going to need 3 assemblers, 13 constructors, which is still quite a lot, but not as much as the basic recipe, and 7 smelters, coming out to 400 megawatts, the cheapest, power-wise at least, recipe that we've shown so far. So in my opinion, what is the best crystal oscillator recipe? In my opinion, it's going to be the basic recipe with the alternate iron wire recipe as well. I really like the way this thing works. It's extremely simple to set up. You are going to have to consume a decent amount of quartz or raw quartz to make your quartz crystals, but I don't think that's too bad. Additionally, making the iron wire is very simple, and you only need 2 items, which compares to the 3 from the basic recipe and 4 from the alternate recipe. Additionally, these 2 items right here, especially the iron, are relatively easy to find, and raw quartz can be found relatively easily as well in small clusters around the map. I would not recommend going with the insulated crystal oscillator recipe unless you got a bunch of rubber just lying around, or you got a bunch of quick wire that you don't know what to do with. But when it comes to the basic recipe without any sort of alternate recipes, this is not bad. So if you are making this and you've seen the title and you're thinking, oh, okay, I've messed up royally here, do not worry, the basic recipe is still completely fine, but I still wanted to throw in this example in case you are trying to make your logistic life a bit simpler, because as someone who's got about 2,000 hours in Satisfactory, Let me tell you, you do want to try and make your logistic life a lot easier, and for me personally, this is a fantastic way to do so. So there we have it. Crystal oscillators are a lot easier to make than what I first realized. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask them in the comments down below, and I'll try my best to answer all of them. Thank you very much for watching. Before we go, a massive shout out to the Knights of the Realm channel members. We have Asuna Yuki, Variance, The Tormal, Yamikel Burns, Hios Rising, Scotland Hattie, and Mau Mau. If you decide to become a Knight of the Realm for just £2.99 a month, you get access to channel-only emotes, unique badges, and also shoutouts in videos. Memberships are the best way to support my channel, but you don't have to become a member. Even just by watching today's video, you are supporting the channel massively. Here's a couple more videos I've made that you might be interested in. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, Godspeed.